A key to understanding the Sabbath is understanding the new moon. Prior to 1998, I had never heard of the New Moon Festival, even though I was raised in church with a big emphasis on Scripture. Later on, no one taught me this subject. I have learned several things by listening to elders teach, but when it comes to the new moon, I learned about it by just reading the Tanakh, what is commonly called the Old Testament. I was driving to a church meeting with my father-in-law once. He was scheduled to speak, and I told him I'd ran across a quote-unquote new moon scripture while I was reading the Bible. It was Isaiah 66:22 through 23, quote, "For as the new heavens and the new earth which I will make shall remain before me, saith Yahweh, so shall your seed and your name remain. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith Yahweh," end of quote. When I first started keeping a Sabbath, Isaiah 66 was huge because it linked the Sabbath up with the new heavens and the new earth, which is in the future. If we would be keeping the Sabbath in the kingdom, why wouldn't we be keeping it now? So that thought came to me mid-1997, but in late 1998, I began wondering why we didn't use the same logic for the new moon. If we were going to worship before Yah from one Sabbath to another, multiple Sabbaths, Yah says here that we will also worship before him from one new moon to another, multiple new moons. If there is something special about the Sabbath here, there has to also be something special about the new moon. Now, some try to argue with Yahweh here and say, well, Isaiah isn't the Torah. I want you to look at the text carefully. Isaiah is the mouthpiece or the messenger. Twice it says, saith Yahweh. And when Yahweh speaks instruction, it's Torah. I had soon after cross-referenced Amos 8:4 through 5 in one of my Bibles, and it read like this, quote, King James Version again, "Hear this, O ye that swallow up the needy, even to make the poor of the land to fail, saying, when will the new moon be gone, that we may sell corn, and the Sabbath, that we may set forth wheat, making the ephah small and the shekel great, and falsifying the balances by deceit," end of quote. Here, the greedy merchants of the land were seeking to cheat the faithful Israelites, but they couldn't on the new moon and Sabbath. Why? Well, it was because the faithful Israelites did not do commerce on a holy day. According to this text, these Israelites did not just honor the Sabbath this way, they also honored the new moon. Now, I remember asking myself back then, would these greedy merchants have wondered when the new moon would be over if they wished to sell something to me? Because at that time I honored a Sabbath, but I did not honor the new moon. Here again, if you track back to Amos 8, verses 2 through 3, Yahweh is speaking. It's Yahweh who is rebuking the greedy merchants for what they are doing. This is Yahweh's instruction, so this too is Torah. After I showed my father-in-law those two texts, he took out his little Franklin Bible pocket computer. We didn't have smartphones back then. And he started searching. He searched and he found new moon, new moons, beginnings of your months, and first day of a month. All of these are related in Scripture, and they make for about 46 occurrences in Holy Scripture. Some things in Scripture are only mentioned a couple times and are still important. But 46 times, there's some importance here. So he and I actually started keeping the new moon holy that next month. For about 1 year, we would keep a Sabbath on Saturday, from Friday evening to Saturday evening. We'd go to work on, let's say, Sunday and Monday, and then a new moon might roll in on a Tuesday. So we'd stop work on that day and keep the new moon holy, and then go back to work Wednesday through Friday and keep Sabbath again on Saturday. It wasn't until late 1999 that we were introduced to the concept of determining the Sabbath by the lunar cycle. It was not difficult for us to see because we were already keeping the new moons holy. One text that I knew at the time, but was so big in convincing me of this lunar aspect of the Sabbath, was from Ezekiel 46, verse 1. This is another prophetic text like Isaiah and Amos, where Yahweh speaks instruction directly. He says, quote, "Thus saith the Master Yahweh, the gate of the inner court that looketh toward the east shall be shut the 6 working days, but on the Sabbath it shall be opened, and in the day of the new moon it shall be opened." What we have here are 3 types of days, not 2, but 3. Every Sabbath keeper will have no problem seeing that this text speaks of the Sabbath as set apart from the 6 working days. But the new moon is mentioned in the same context as set apart from the 6 working days. Neither Sabbath or new moon are one of the 6 working days. And the Sabbath and new moon are related here as holy, but yet they are still distinct from each other. Now, back then, our method of Saturday Sabbath went kind of like this. If the new moon came in on a Tuesday, would the gate of the inner court be shut or open? Now, you could say, we're going to open the gate, but that would interrupt the 6 working days where you would not have 6 consecutive days of work. You might then say, well, we're going to shut the gate because it's one of the 6 working days. Yet the text explicitly says the gate is to be opened on the day of the new moon. So which is it? It's a conundrum. Unless, catch this, unless the new moon somehow never falls on one of the 6 working days, just like the Sabbath. No one has this problem with whether to open or close the gate of the inner court on the Sabbath, because everyone acknowledges that the Sabbath never falls on one of the 6 working days. Why then do we not acknowledge the same for the new moon when it's mentioned in the same context in Ezekiel 46, verse 1? And by the way, this is not one Sabbath or one new moon or month. Ezekiel 46, verse 3 says, "The people of the land shall worship at the door of this gate before Yahweh in the Sabbaths and in the new moons." A Sabbath takes place at the end of each week, and a new moon takes place at the beginning of each month. I soon realized that the new moon, like the Sabbath, had different specified offerings from the 6 working days in each Hebrew month. Numbers chapter 28, verses 11 through 15. And that the new moon was set apart by blowing the silver trumpets, Numbers 10:10, which were used, by the way, to call an assembly. I also figured out that most of the book of Devarim or Deuteronomy was actually an 11th new moon sermon by Prophet Moshe, Deuteronomy 1, verse 3. I was reading all of these texts, and I was reading them with childlike eyes and with childlike faith. And I was just believing them as I read them. I had no bone to pick. I soon found out that other people had read them and came to the same or similar conclusion, even if they didn't keep the new moons themselves. One shocker of an example that I found was in the John MacArthur Study Bible. In his note on Amos 8, verse 5, MacArthur writes, quote, "Based on a lunar calendar, Israel would celebrate the day with a festival. Like the Sabbath, no work was to be done." 1 Samuel 25 through 6, 2 Kings 4:23, Ezekiel 46:3. The merchants' eagerness for the day to end revealed their appetite for greed. End of that quote. I looked it up in my Old Smith's Bible Dictionary, and it stated in part under the heading New Moon. I'm going to read the words. You can see the scripture references on the screen. Quote, "The first day of the lunar month was observed as a holy day. In addition to the daily sacrifice, there were offered 2 young bullocks, a ram and 7 lambs of the first year as a burnt offering, with the proper meat offerings and drink offerings, and a kid as a sin offering. As on the Sabbath, trade and handicraft work were stopped, and the temple was open for public worship. The trumpets were blown at the offering of the special sacrifices for the day, as on solemn festivals. It was an occasion for state banquets. And later, if not in earlier times, fasting was intermitted at the new moons. The new moons are generally mentioned so as to show that they were regarded as a peculiar class of holy days, distinguished from the solemn feasts and the Sabbaths." End of that quote. Later on in my studies, many years later, I found this from the newer IVP Bible Background Commentary on the Older Testament. This is on page 727 under Ezekiel 46:1. It states, quote, keyed to their use of a lunar calendar, ancient Israel marked the first day of the month with its new moon phase as a festival day every 29 or 30 days. As on the Sabbath, all work was to cease. See Amos 8:5. And there were sacrifices to be made. Numbers 28:11 through 15. The festival continued to be observed in the post-exilic period. Ezra 3:5, Nehemiah 10:33. After I started keeping the new moons holy back in 1998, I soon began running into people who tried their best to do what I'm going to call explain away what the scriptures said. I was told that new moon was a bad translation and should be just rendered as month. I was told that Israel's calendar was strictly solar and had no lunar aspect to it. Thankfully, I was already a student of Scripture, and I knew that Genesis 1:14 through 19, which doesn't specifically name either the sun or the moon, it just mentions the two great lights. Well, that scripture has a parallel in Psalm 136:7 through 9, and Jeremiah 31:35, where both great lights are mentioned by name, the sun and the moon. And they were to be for signs, seasons, days, and years, not just the sun, not just the moon, but both great lights. People tried to tell me that the Hebrew word chodesh, translated as new moon or new moons 21 times in the King James Version, was not a lunar term. But what they tried to tell me was different from what I read in my concordances and lexicons. Strong's Concordance, Jessenius's Hebrew Chaldee Lexicon, and Brown Drivers and Briggs Hebrew Lexicon, all these that I had and that I owned, said it was a lunar term and that new moon or lunar month were accurate renderings. I actually found places in the Hebrew Bible where the word chodesh was actually interchangeable with the word yerach. Yerach is the Hebrew word for the orb of the moon. These two places you can examine it are 1 Kings 6:38 and 1 Kings 8 verse 2. Yerach is actually used in Exodus 2 verse 2, where Jochebed hides her new baby, who we know as Moshe, for 3 months, literally 3 Yerachim, or 3 moons. Some have even went so far to say that Chodesh can't be translated as new moon because it doesn't have the word new in it. This stems from ignorance, and it is a flat-out denial of what the Hebrew lexicons tell us. Strong's Concordance and Brown Drivers Briggs Hebrew Lexicon tell us that the word Chodesh 23:20 is taken from Chadash 23:18, meaning to be new, renew, or repair. Hebrew number 23:19, Chadash, which is used as an adjective in Hebrew scripture, is translated as new or fresh 53 times in the King James Version. All these words have the same Hebrew letters, Chet, Dalet, and Shin, just different vowel points. The word itself, Chodesh, has to do with new or renew. On top of this, we have a Greek language witness in the Septuagint and in the Newer Testament. By the way, our English words month and moon are derived from the Greek word main. The Greek word main is defined by Kittle's Theological Dictionary of the New Testament as, quote, moon or month. The Greek word for new moon is slightly different than main. It is pneumania, literally meaning new month, new moon, actually. And it is used several times in the Septuagint. A couple of those times are in Exodus 40, verse 2, when Moshe erected the tabernacle, and Numbers 10, verse 10, with the calling of the assemblies, the blowing of the silver trumpets on the new moons. You can also see the word pneumania used in Numbers 28:11 and in Ezekiel 46, verse 1, all having to do with the beginnings of the Hebrew months. Each month, brothers and sisters, has a beginning or a rosh, a head. We are not talking about the beginning of the year in these texts, but the beginning of each month. And this is why the book of Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus, which was in the 1611 KJV, Sirach 43, 6 through 8, is an additional BC witness. It tells us that the moon, 1, declares times, 2, is a sign of feasts, and 3, that the month is called after her name. We do have one Newer Testament witness of this in Colossians 2:16, where the word pneumania, the same word used in the Septuagint, is used. And there is a digression of holy occurrences mentioned here. We have the feast days or the holy days that are observed yearly. We call them Passover, Pentecost, or Tabernacles. Then we have the new moons. They are observed monthly, and then it digresses to the Sabbaths, which are observed weekly. So the new moon, the monthly feast, is sandwiched right in between the annual festivals and the weekly Sabbaths. This makes no sense if the new moon is just a regular workday. There is a reason that Yahweh put that big bright moon in the night sky. There is a reason that it changes shape each night. It is a beacon, a sign, a signal. Psalm 89 verse 37 tells us that the moon is a faithful witness in the sky. And Proverbs 14 verse 5 says a faithful witness does not lie. It is only men who boot the moon out of the calendar who are lying. If you remove the moon from the calendar, if you remove the moon from the heavenly reckoning of time, you are removing the helpmeet in heaven. And that is because the moon is likened to a wife in Genesis 37, 9 through 11. Yahweh put her up there to be a helper to the sun sun. The moon cannot do what the sun does, but the sun cannot do what the moon does. They are like the long and short hands on a clock. Both of them have important functions, and we should not do away with either of them. There is so much more that could be said, but I'll close with this. When all the dust settles, those childlike eyes that I had when I first read Isaiah 66:23 and Amos 8 verse 5, those eyes were correct. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't trying to disprove anything. You know what I was doing? I was humbly reading Scripture and doing my best to just believe what was written. It is peculiar that no Sabbatarian that I have ever met has a problem with just believing Isaiah 66:23 at face value, that we will worship Yahweh from one Sabbath to another in the new heavens and the new earth. They don't have a problem with the text until somebody brings up the new moon that's in the same verse, in the same sentence. Only then do the excuses start. Well, it doesn't really mean new moon. Well, let's go back to Exodus. Well, we can't believe that it means that. Oh, it just means month to month. And then you have some Christians that say, well, if new moon means month to month, then why doesn't Sabbath just mean week to week? All these excuses start when you bring up the new moon. So I want to ask you today, humbly, are you going to believe the text just as strongly about the new moon? Or are you going to figure out a way to get around what the text says? I want to encourage you to believe it and to start practicing it now, so you can prepare yourself for the worship that will go to Almighty Yah in the new heavens and the new earth. Once you grasp the significance of the new moon, that it really is a holy day and that it cannot fall on one of the 6 working days, you will be able to see so clearly the concept of the Sabbath being determined, at least in part, by the lunar cycle that Yahweh created and ordained.